Hi everyone, and welcome to the third instalment of our commercialization seminar series. So today's webinar, it will be a one-person show. I'll be introducing and presenting. So I hope it's an enjoyable experience for everyone. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about have you ruined your chances at securing intellectual property. And it's all about disclosure. So just a little bit about myself before we dive in. So I did my undergrad at the University of Wollongong in medical biotechnology advanced, and I got first class honours. I then came up to Sydney, where I did my PhD at the Children's Medical Research Institute with the University of Sydney. And so I was involved in researching and investigating the mechanisms of endocytosis, the way in which external objects are internalized inside a cell. And so I was heavily involved in a drug development program surrounding that physiology, and it led to a patent on intellectual property position. In my current role, I'm a project manager for Westmead Research Hub. And among many other things, I'm involved in commercialization and efforts and strategy development across the Westmead precinct. And this is done in close collaboration with our Westmead Research Hub commercialization committee. And so in doing that as well, I'm also undertaking my Master of Business Administration, or MBA, part-time. So with that, I would just like to encourage everyone to submit questions as they see fit. And full disclaimer, I'm not an expert, as you can imagine, in this space, but I do have some experience here, and so I'll try my best to answer any questions that come through. So let's get started with the presentation. So as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking to you about disclosure and its impact and role it has in securing intellectual property. So the presentation today, I'm going to be giving a brief overview of what to expect. So first I'm going to be talking to you about what is disclosure, and then I'm going to be talking to you about why it matters. Then where does the disclosure occur, and what you can do to prevent it. And then I'm going to spend quite a significant amount of time reviewing case studies, because I figured it's the best way to do this, to put myself in the researcher's shoes and describe research programs and how you can avoid disclosure in those instances. So what is disclosure? So I think it's important to recognize that scientists are innovators. They're consistently making novel discoveries in the healthcare space. But there's this mentality within the community, and it's surrounding publish or perish. And it's where, you know, researchers, and when I was in this myself, I very much felt it. It's that there's a continual pressure to present research findings at conferences, publish papers, and it's all in trying to obtain the best possible track record when it comes to grant season time and grant writing. So you look the best on paper, and it gives you the best chance at securing grants. Shifting gear a little bit, disclosure, by definition, is the public, non-confidential communication of an idea, invention, or discovery. So I'm sure you can kind of already note that there is a bit of a conundrum between the two, that there is a pressure to constantly divulge details, publish your work, present your work, but disclosure means that, you know, that happens in this process. So why this is important is because in order to successfully acquire an intellectual property position, you need what's known as novelty. And so novelty means that no one else in the world has heard about this. And as you can imagine, it's lost in the event of public disclosure, because it provides other people an avenue to replicate your invention. So imagine you're presenting at a conference. Someone sitting in the conference can go, oh, wow, that's an amazing discovery. And if you give them enough details, they can go into their own lab and replicate your discovery. And so if this rule wasn't in place, then someone else could file for intellectual property based on hearing about your discovery. And so intellectual property is obtained in exchange for first disclosure. So what that means is that the first time anyone is hearing about your research project is through the patenting process. So in submitting an application for intellectual property, that is an act of first disclosure, which is not possible if you've already disclosed or mentioned details around your research program or invention in the public forum. So like I mentioned earlier, there really is this conundrum that it's like researchers are constantly trying to present and publish as much as possible, but in doing so, it can nullify the acquisition of intellectual property. However, there are some simple solutions to this, so I will go into that in today's seminar. So what are some examples of research that may have intellectual property? It can include, but it's certainly not limited to, say, the discovery of a new drug, or you find that an existing drug on the market can be repurposed for a novel indication or disease. Say you're doing your experiment and you come across a new protein target, whether that's derived from experimental or bioinformatic analysis, that displays promise in a disease of interest. Say you're doing an experiment where you have two cell population types. One is indicative of a disease model and the other is a control. And you say do some proteomic analysis between the two cell populations, and you identify that one protein is significantly upregulated relative to the control. That might be a promising target in that particular disease of interest. Another is a new method of delivery. So gene therapy is quite a huge focus on the Westmead precinct, and so they utilize viral vectors to deliver the CRISPR-Cas9 gene modifying machinery to cells, and so that's a method of delivery. If you find a new drug and you find where it's binding on the enzyme, that might give you an opportunity to design better drugs. So that binding site might also have intellectual property. And finally, medical devices are another strength, especially as it relates to the hospital's work. And so any newly designed medical device might have some intellectual property. So if I thought I would just highlight a previous presentation that was given. So our first installment was surrounding the basics of intellectual property. So and it was delivered by Catherine Sun. It was a fantastic presentation. So if you would like to know more about the basics and you haven't seen that presentation, please visit the Westmead Research Hub website at westmead.org.au. Go to the events tab, the top right, and select for the commercialization seminar series. And this one's called What is Intellectual Property? The Basics. So moving on, why does disclosure matter? So like I mentioned earlier, public disclosure threatens the acquisition of intellectual property. And so the way you have to think about it is that intellectual property really is the backbone or the key asset that's needed in the journey from taking a scientific discovery from the lab bench to the clinic to help patients. Now, there are exclusions. There are exclusions to this rule, but the overwhelming majority, this is how it works. So in referring to this diagram, we can see right at the beginning, this is where researchers and scientists are. It's about making the scientific discoveries. But what most people do without considering any of this is that they go towards publishing and presenting straight away. And so in doing that, that's disclosure, and that essentially eliminates any opportunity to obtain intellectual property. But what we should be doing instead is the following. So we make a scientific discovery. We then evaluate that discovery for commercial potential. Now, these steps are done in collaboration with your in-house commercialization experts. So every institution across Westmead has a dedicated staff member to carry out this function. And so what we do is the commercialization staff, in collaboration with the researcher, will evaluate that discovery for commercial potential. Is it viable? Does it represent something novel? Can it be ultimately translated into the clinic to help patients with any given disorder? And so if there is commercial value, then an intellectual property application will be made. But if there isn't, then publication should ensue essentially immediately after. And once that application's been filed, then there's no issue with publishing it either. So this is all done in collaboration with the commercialization staff. They do have a strong track record of doing this, of acquisition of intellectual property and really marketing and developing the technology and pushing it through this pipeline. So once you have intellectual property, you then go out into the market. You then start engaging with, say, a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company or an investor. And you start essentially pitching your idea. You tell them why your technology is so unique and so amazing and what impact it can have. Now, it's necessary to involve these companies and investors because, as I'll mention in the next slide, it takes over $1 billion with a B to develop the average drug from discovery through to the clinic. And so I'm not sure about any researchers who might be watching this seminar, but I don't have that kind of money and I don't think many people do. So it necessitates their involvement. And it's not just the money as well. It's also the supply chains. It's all of their capabilities that they have on top of that. So assuming that you market the technology, you pitch it, and an investor or a company finds it exceptionally interesting, then you can go into the negotiation phase where you can talk about, what sort of arrangement you would like with that investor or that company. So that can take the form of, say, a license. So a license is whereby the company will pay you for the rights to use your intellectual property, whether it's exclusively or non-exclusively. And there are other arrangements, for example, such as sponsored research and development agreements, where essentially an agreement is made with the laboratory head of the lab to fund additional development and product optimization. And so that's another revenue stream that can be coming into the lab that's independent of government grants. And so finally, you move forward towards the final transaction, and then that's when it goes off into further product development, so optimization, clinical trials, registration and reimbursement, and that's when a product ultimately, assuming all of that goes well, which it often doesn't, goes into the clinic and helps patients. So two very important points here. So the first, as I alluded to earlier, is that the average investment required to take a novel drug to market is about $1.34 billion US. And the journey is exceptionally high risk. I believe the stat is, but I might be incorrect here, that for every 5 therapies that enter into clinical trials, say phase 1, only 1 eventually progresses into being a clinical product that's used by humans in both a safe and efficacious manner. So that is high risk. And so this necessitates the involvement of these companies and investors. And so they really need intellectual property. They really need that asset, that backbone to commit this level of resources. Because the intellectual property position gives you exclusivity. It prevents anyone else from exploiting your invention. And so it acts as a barrier to entry for other competitors. And depending on your arrangements, the negotiations with companies, say in the form of licensing or sponsored research and development agreements, that can bring in laboratory funding to continue vital research in your own lab. Because if you have the capabilities and they don't, it makes sense for them to leverage what is already pre-existing and just provide more financial backing for you to continue your research in terms of further product development. And so with grants and their success rates continuing to dwindle, this is actually quite a viable opportunity to expand different revenue streams and ultimately improve research outcomes. So it's definitely worth considering. Now, where can disclosure occur? So just a reminder that disclosure is the public non-confidential communication of an idea or an invention. And so all of the following examples can be seen as prior art. So prior art is essentially anything that when the patenting process is underway and they're searching for prior art, they're trying to establish whether or not there's been a similar invention or the details of your invention disclosed or messaged in the public domain. And so if there is prior art, then that means that there's no novelty associated with your application. And so that means it will be rejected and your invention won't be able to have intellectual property backing to it. So some of the examples are listed here. So publications are a big one, like I mentioned, journal articles in any format, website posts, blogs are another example. Abstracts, so following successful grant applications, whether that be successful grant applications and or poster oral presentations at conferences. Abstract details from both of those, if you're successful, can be made publicly available. It's far more common in poster and oral presentations, but grant applications, if the abstract or any particular or pertinent details from that grant are put out into the public domain following its success, that is disclosure. Another relevant to students is a thesis. So masters or PhD students have to be careful with where their thesis ends up because it frequently goes into a database that can be accessed by other people. But applications can be made to the university to delay public availability of this. And finally, as mentioned, presentations. So poster and oral presentations at a conference, disclosure, final seminars for PhD students or master's students, or department and institute seminars. So if you have a webinar link and you present to your institute, the moment that that link is made publicly available to someone outside of your institution, that constitutes disclosure. So this is where it can occur. It's worth noting that there is what's known as a grace period. So 6 months to a year is the typical grace period between the date that you publicly disclose your invention or its use in the public and filing for your intellectual property application. But in saying this, this doesn't exist in every country or jurisdiction, and so it shouldn't be relied upon. So China and the European Union are two major jurisdictions that don't recognize a grace period. And so you can imagine if you have an intellectual property position and you're having these discussions with an investor or a company that's looking to further develop your technology, and you tell them, look, sorry, I had to utilize the grace period. So, we won't have any exclusivity in the European Union or China, massive markets, then that acts as less of a selling point for them to help develop your technology. So it's just something to keep in mind moving forward. So please do, if you can, don't rely on the fact that a grace period does exist in some countries and jurisdictions. So what can you do to prevent disclosure? So hopefully to now I've I've highlighted that disclosure is, in fact, quite important to avoid. So the first two pieces of advice, first is familiarise yourself with the basics of intellectual property and the requirements of patentability. So that novelty element that I mentioned earlier is one requirement. And so you would have seen that I put up details relating to Dr. Catherine Sun's presentation. This provides a solid foundation, and the presentation only goes for an hour, and it's great. It will allow you to understand and upskill and familiarise yourself with these concepts. Second is, and I can't stress this enough, and you'll probably hear this from me another 6 or 7 times before the presentation is over. But have a preemptive discussion about your research project with your in-house commercialisation expert. Each of the institutions at Westmead has a commercialisation head or manager or business development manager, and they all have a wealth of experience in this. So even if you haven't discovered anything, but you feel your research is heading in that direction, say that example earlier that you're about to carry out a proteomics study between 2 cell populations, and you think that if you do find something, it might be useful, talk to them about it and just flag it with them, and they can help put a strategy in place to make sure that any intellectual property that comes out of it is protected. So this point applies to everyone, whether you're a student, postdoctoral fellow, lab leader, anyone. Please have a preemptive discussion about your research with them. What else can you do? So if it's necessary to mention specifics about your invention, whether it's to a potential investor or a company collaborator, and you've yet to put a intellectual property position in place, or you want to be super safe and just have this anyway, there are these things known as non-disclosure agreements, where both parties sign, and it means that the content of what's marked as confidential or your research won't be entered into the public domain. So each of the commercialization experts, they have a template agreement for this. It's essentially just fill in the details and sign, but there is a template and they can guide you through this process. The next point, and it's very important, and it's to apply for intellectual property before submitting a manuscript for publication. Now, it's quite commonplace to repurpose parts of a manuscript for patent applications. So even if you haven't had that preemptive discussion with your commercialization or business development staff member, let them know and flag it with them when you begin to draft the paper. And that will give you enough time to work with them and any lawyers that are either outsourced or in-house to submit both the journal article for review and the patent application in parallel without any delay. So it's important to recognise that these things, if you time them appropriately, it won't delay your ability to publish and get your research out there in the public domain. Another one, as it relates to presentations, in the context of a poster presentation or an oral presentation, it's important to ensure that you don't mention specific details in the public domain. So you might think, for example, that it might be best to just completely stop presenting your research altogether. Of course, that's the safest option, but that's not realistic for most researchers, as I'm sure everyone can understand. So substitution of key information is a great avenue with which to avoid disclosure, but still be able to tell your story to the scientific community. So some tips here. For example, if you have a new protein target, like I mentioned, or a compound for a given disease, don't mention its actual name or display its structure or what it looks like. Instead, you can refer to it as protein X or compound X or drug X, and either completely remove its structure or replace it with something that's completely different. If, for example, you discover a novel formulation that can have therapeutic benefit for a given disease, don't divulge its composition. You can tell the story, but simply just refer to it as formulation X, for example. And again, it goes for the same for a medical device to treat a given disease. Don't divulge its design or how it's made. Say, for example, if you're presenting it, you have an oral presentation, just call it medical device X, or replace the structure with a PCR machine. You can still tell the story, but people in the audience will understand that because you want to take this new invention and take it to market and take it and hopefully have it become a clinically utilized solution. People understand that people are on different phases of that journey, and so omitting key details like that is understandable. So I think what I'll do is I'll finish off with a few scientific case studies. So I've got two. And so it's important to note that the following examples, they're just completely fictitious. So any resemblance to existing research programs is purely coincidental. And it's important to note for intellectual property assessment of your own research and what you can do to avoid disclosure, which threatens intellectual property acquisition, see your in-house commercialization staff member. So if you're not sure who they are, you can visit the Westmead Research Hub website at westmead.org.au/research/research commercialization. So moving on to the case studies. So the first of two is a fictitious Alzheimer's disease therapy. So here's some background. So you're a researcher in a neuroscience lab and you're investigating Alzheimer's disease onset. During your experiments, you discover that an enzyme known as thiopurine methyltransferase, its expression levels are significantly upregulated when you compare a diseased cell population to a control. And so this could have been discovered through proteomic analysis or genomic analysis of neurons derived from patient iPSCs, for example. You then find that this enzyme is interesting. You think this could be a potential new target, or this could be a potential new therapy. So you decide to undertake a drug screen. You outsource it to a drug screening facility to identify inhibitors. So you could see whether or not there are any drugs that can be used to inhibit the activity of this enzyme in mouse models and delay the onset of disease. So this is the case study, but let's delve into it. So where is the novelty in this discovery? And what potential intellectual property exists? First, the enzyme, the thiopurine methyltransferase, is upregulated. You have to ask yourself, has this enzyme ever been linked to Alzheimer's disease or its treatment? If not, targeting of this enzyme to prevent disease onset might be a patentable discovery. What about the two drugs that you discovered in your drug screen of 60,000 compounds? You only got 2 hits. Have either of these 2 drugs ever been linked to Alzheimer's disease treatment? Are these compounds completely new and not currently used in humans? Or are they on the market to treat another disease? Could they potentially be repurposed to treat Alzheimer's disease? And if you have any indication of where these drugs are binding to inhibit the enzyme, could you use this binding site information to develop better drugs? So these are the sorts of questions that you have to ask yourself as you're undertaking your new research and identifying novelty and where potential intellectual property exists. So to answer these questions, I'm sure all scientists listening have done a literature review before using journals. So review the literature in the journals, see if it's out there. Another avenue is patent databases. Now, most people don't have familiarity with patent databases, but it is essentially like a Google search for patents that have already been submitted or that are have gone through the patenting process, but they aren't necessarily in the public domain as a journal, for example. And second is to discuss your research project and your findings with an in-house commercialization expert. So as it relates to patent databases, we did run a seminar previously. Our second installment was delivered by Reg, who's an IP and commercialization lawyer at the Children's Medical Research Institute. And so there's a recording available on the Westmead Research Hub website, and the details are there. It's similar to the basics of intellectual property presentation. It's in the same place, and it's called Has Your Research Already Been Discovered? And it's about using intellectual property databases. So if you'd like to learn more about what sort of databases exist and how you can use this tool, please go and watch that presentation. Now, the all-important question is, how can a researcher avoid disclosure in this instance? So as it relates to presentations, whether it's a poster or oral presentation, the safest option is to avoid discussing the research project altogether, but I understand that that's not always feasible. So substitution of key details to prevent anyone else in the audience from copying your invention is an appropriate strategy. So we identified the enzyme, and we also identified the two drugs. So what can we do about it? It's as simple as this. It may seem trivial, but this works. So let's have a look. So we've changed the structure of the enzyme to something completely different. We've removed the name and refer to it instead as protein X. And instead of divulging the structures that came from your drug screen, we've now replaced it with the caffeine and aspirin molecule. And so this sort of strategy still allows you to tell the story and still allows you to divulge, you know, the scientific process and wow the people in the audience, but it just doesn't provide the specifics. And again, people understand that this is an issue and it's worth taking care of. What about when it comes to publications? Of course, you can't do that in publications. Publications need the specific details of the scientific method, what you found, the structures, all of that. But like I mentioned earlier, assuming you haven't already talked to your commercialization expert in-house, it is commonplace to repurpose part of a draft manuscript for an intellectual property application. So the moment you think, okay, I've got a story here, let's publish it, and you start writing that draft manuscript, go and let your commercialization expert in-house know that you're doing this. And so it will take minimal additional effort on the part of the researcher because the scientific details, you can just take it from the draft manuscript as you're writing it. And then when both are ready, you can submit them in tandem. And so there's limited delay if you involve people early. So it is very much just about good timing and involving the experts early. I've now got a second case study, and this is my final one, and it relates to a diabetes therapy. So you're a researcher in a diabetes lab focusing on next generation therapies and devices to assist patients who have been diagnosed with a disorder. But you come up with a brilliant idea. Let's develop an implantable medical device that can actively monitor blood sugar levels and, when required, secrete a long-life, heat-stable solution that balances sugar levels in humans. You go to the drawing board and you experiment for years and years until you successfully design a functional and biocompatible implantable device, as you can see here. So again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to identify where the novelty lies in this process. So first, that long life heat stable solution. Is the composition of the solution a new formulation, or is it already known? Is there intellectual property surrounding its composition to be had there? As it relates to the medical device, does the external and internal design, say the sensor and secretion coupling mechanism, require protection? Does its design need intellectual property around it? What about the composition of the device? The fact that it is biocompatible, does that make it unique? And finally, does the position of implantation in a patient matter to the effectiveness of the device? So these are all questions that you can be asking yourself when and relating it to your own experimental procedures and protocols. So again, the answer is the same. To answer these questions, review the literature in journals, review patent databases, and discuss your project with your commercialization expert and see if there's anything there. See if there is any intellectual property position. Now, how can we avoid disclosure in this instance? Again, the answers are essentially identical between the case studies. The first is to, the safest option is to avoid discussing it altogether. But like I said, substitution of key details that would prevent someone else from copying it is a more realistic way to go about it. So I've put the long life heat stable solution in a purple box because do we really have to do anything about that? It's already vague enough as it is. You don't know what the composition of that solution is. And so that's not something that will need a substitution strategy. However, the medical device, which you've clearly displayed here, as well as the implementation side, those are two things that may be needed to be substituted to avoid disclosure and allow you to obtain intellectual property. So what we've done there is essentially just change the structure of the medical device to something completely different and changed the implantation site. And you know, of course, if you don't want to mislead your audience, you just let them know that, you know, it is a potential intellectual property position and that you have put it in a generic place. And again, they will understand. Again, when it comes to publications, you need to divulge all the details, but again, involve your commercialization expert early, and so you can repurpose parts of a draft manuscript for an intellectual property application. And so again, it really does take minimal effort or delay for the researcher. So just to summarize, the first is that it really does just start with the scientist. Adopt an innovation mindset. Look at your research from the perspective of inventiveness and intellectual property. See if there's anything novel there and understand its potential beyond publication. Second, apply for intellectual property with guidance from your commercialization staff before you present or publish any details in the public domain. When presenting your work, whether it's through a poster or oral presentation, exercise caution when writing abstracts and presenting your work in those formats. And substitution of key details is one way to avoid disclosure in this circumstance. And finally, like I said, I did tell you I'd mention it 6 or 7 more times, but here I'm going to mention it again. Really do discuss your research with your relevant commercialization expert and take their advice on how to protect your intellectual property. So you can see them listed here, and this is across all the institutions. But for more details, again, please go to westmead.org.au. In the research drop-down menu, visit research commercialization. So what I'll do is I'll stop there for now. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And I can see that there are several questions. And so I'll go to those now. So a first just relates to links to previous webinars. So I did cover that in my presentation, but again, visit the Westmead Research Hub website. Does a grant application count as disclosure? And someone else made a comment that it's generally only the titles that are made public. That is true. It generally is only the titles of the grants that are made public, but it's something to keep an eye out for because there are some granting schemes that do publicly post an abstract relating to your grant. So it's just something that you have to check and don't assume that all successful grant applications will not count to or contribute to disclosure. I've got another comment here that as it relates to the non-disclosure agreements for people at CMRI, Julia Hill has mentioned that you can find a template on the Chromosome intranet. But again, if you're at any other institution, please feel free to discuss this with your commercialization or business development staff member, and they will likely have a template on hand. Another question is, can you discuss research/inventions during lab meetings? Yep, so that's a good question. So that should be perfectly fine, because at the end of the day, lab meetings are in a closed environment, and typically all of the researchers, if you refer to your employee agreement as you first sign up to work at the Research Institute, you do promise to essentially not disclose anything that you might hear in the within the context of the institute. So as long as it's kept within an institute, it should be fine. However, it's once the link becomes publicly available, that's when it becomes an issue, because there's someone else out there who's not held by that same agreement who could potentially replicate your discussion, sorry, your invention. I'm just looking if there are any other questions. So there's another question here regarding the first case study. If you've discovered an upregulated enzyme but yet to find 2 compounds that can block it, can you patent the enzyme? Is that sufficiently novel? Yes, absolutely. You don't need to go the entire way. I only went the entire way for the purposes of the case study. But yes, an upregulated enzyme, for example, if you demonstrate that you can knock it down with an siRNA or something like that, and it has a phenotypic effect, that would be that may be enough evidence. But again, this changes from research story to research story. So again, it's very much more appropriate to discuss this with your commercialization expert, and yeah, have them put a strategy in place for that. I've also just got another comment here, and it's a good one, as it relates to the lab meetings that I mentioned. If you have external people coming to your lab meeting, do get them to sign, and you feel like you're going to be discussing something inventive there, get them to sign that non-disclosure agreement in advance, so again, that you have some protection there. So that's essentially all the questions for now. So that's fantastic to hear. So with that, what I'll do is I will just close the seminar. But before I do, I'd just like to point out that the next installment of our webinar will be on August 18th, 2021, and it will be surrounding developing a medical device. And we will get someone in who has started a company surrounding a medical device, and get them to present on their journey and how they went from the lab to a startup company. So the details are there for you. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everyone again for attending this seminar series. And I look forward to seeing you all for the next installment. So take care, everyone, and stay safe as it relates to the lockdowns and the continuing pandemic situation. Thanks, everyone. Bye.